The closing can't happen until Ms. Catalina Freeman signs. Those were the first words I heard when I walked into the attorney's office, and nothing about them made sense. Why was my late grandmother's cabin being sold without anyone telling me why had my father sold it to my brother for just $1? And why was a decades-old recorded document with my grandmother's signature suddenly sitting in the middle of the closing table? My father looked straight at me and said, "You stopped being part of this family years ago." Then the attorney quietly replied, "Actually, your grandmother made sure she never could." Before I tell you how I found out what Grandma had really protected, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Leave your country and your local time in the comments, and if stories about family truth and earned justice speak to you, consider subscribing so you won't miss what happened next. The drive from Minneapolis to Pine Harbor took just under 3 hours, but it felt much longer because my mind refused to stay in the present. Every mile marker pulled me backward. I kept replaying the look on my father's face when I walked into Melissa Carter's office that morning. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't embarrassment. It was annoyance, as if I had interrupted a routine errand instead of discovering that my family's most treasured property had been sold without my knowledge. Harold Freeman had always believed certainty sounded like authority. He rarely raised his voice. He simply stated things as though no reasonable person could disagree. "The paperwork is already done. It belongs with Logan. Your grandmother would have wanted us to keep it simple." Only Melissa's interruption had stopped him. "The closing cannot proceed." Not because she sided with me, because the law did. That distinction mattered. As I turned onto County Road 14, the dense pine forest opened to reveal the lake I'd known almost my entire life. The water looked exactly the way I remembered it, clear enough to reflect the clouds like polished glass surrounded by white pines that had somehow survived storms, harsh winters, and generations of family disagreements. The cabin sat exactly where it always had. Small, weathered, unpretentious. People unfamiliar with northern Minnesota might have looked at it and seen an aging 2-bedroom cabin worth little more than the land beneath it. Grandma Margaret saw something else. So did I. She used to tell me, "Some places teach you who you are. Don't confuse their value with their price." I was 10 years old the first time she handed me a ring of rusty keys and said, "Go unlock the boathouse." I remember freezing. "You trust me." She laughed. "I trust people who pay attention." That sentence followed me through my entire life. While my brother Logan spent summers fishing with friends or riding ATVs through neighboring trails, Grandma somehow always found work that required patience instead of excitement. Inventory every tool after winter. Label old family photographs. Record which roof shingles needed replacing. Write down the serial numbers on every generator and chainsaw. Keep receipts in dated envelopes. At the time, I thought she was simply organized. Years later, after building a career in commercial real estate compliance in Chicago, I realized she had quietly taught me something far more valuable. Documentation protects memory. Memory alone rarely survives conflict. When I was 16, Grandma began trusting me with the annual maintenance notebook. Every spring, we walked the property together. She would point toward the shoreline. "Take pictures." I snapped photographs. "The dock." "No, the shoreline." I didn't understand. "What am I looking for?" "Anything different." We photographed erosion, trees, fence posts, water levels, boat slips. I assumed it was part of owning lake property. Only much later would I appreciate how carefully she documented every change. Nothing about Grandma happened by accident. After high school, I earned a scholarship to the University of Illinois. Leaving Minnesota was harder than I admitted. The night before I moved into my dorm, Grandma handed me a small leather notebook. Inside, she had written only one sentence. "Never sign anything you haven't read twice." I laughed. You know most grandmothers give recipes. She smiled. You'll collect recipes on your own. She hugged me longer than usual, but judgment takes practice. During college, I returned almost every summer. When internships kept me away, I still called every Sunday evening. Grandma always asked the same question first. How's work? Then the second. When are you coming home? Not once did she ask when I planned to stay permanently. She wanted me to build my own life. Harold didn't see it that way. According to my father, moving to Chicago meant I had chosen career over family. He repeated that story often enough that eventually other relatives accepted it as fact. Your sister's too busy. Catalina has a corporate job now. She doesn't have time for this place anymore. None of those statements were actually true. I simply couldn't spend every weekend driving 8 hours each way. What nobody mentioned was everything happening behind the scenes. When the cabin roof needed replacing, I paid half. When the old furnace finally failed one January, I wired money before Harold even asked. When Grandma insisted she didn't need help covering property taxes after a difficult year, I quietly mailed a cashier's check to her post office box. She always tried returning it. I always found another excuse. One Christmas she laughed and said, "You're as stubborn as I am." I learned from the best. Logan appreciated those efforts. At least I thought he did. He'd text me photos after repairs. The new dock looks great. Thanks for helping, Dad. The cabin survived another winter. Simple messages. Nothing suggested he viewed me as an outsider. That illusion lasted until Grandma's health began failing. She was 83 when she slipped on icy porch steps and fractured her hip. The surgery went well, but recovery was slow. Because I worked full-time in Chicago, Harold naturally became the person coordinating doctor appointments and daily care. I never questioned it. In fact, I was grateful. Every Thursday evening, I called Grandma. Sometimes Harold answered first. She's sleeping. The therapist wore her out. Maybe tomorrow. I accepted those explanations because they sounded reasonable. When I finally reached Grandma, she never complained. She asked about my projects, my apartment, whether Chicago winters were still unbearable. Only once did she say something unusual. Don't assume silence means nothing's changing. Before I could ask what she meant, Harold picked up another phone in the house. Mom needs to rest. The call ended. I thought about that conversation for months. Then work became overwhelming. A promotion brought longer hours, more responsibility, and frequent travel. I visited less often than I wanted, but I never stopped contributing. Every expense connected to the cabin was entered into my budgeting software: insurance reimbursements, repair invoices, contractor payments, even landscaping bills. That habit wasn't unusual for me. Compliance professionals document everything. Apparently, Grandma had trained me well. I parked outside the cabin and stepped onto the gravel driveway. Nothing looked different at first. Then small details began appearing. Fresh tire tracks, a stack of survey stakes leaning against the garage, bright orange utility flags near the tree line. Someone had recently measured something. That wasn't routine maintenance. As I walked around the property, I noticed another change. The old wooden trail markers Grandma and I had installed years earlier were gone. In their place stood small plastic stakes with handwritten numbers. Development markers. I recognized them immediately from commercial projects in Illinois. Someone had already started evaluating the land. Not just the cabin, the land. My stomach tightened. Before I reached the porch, a familiar voice called my name. Catalina. I turned to see Helen Dawson crossing the neighboring yard, moving slower than I remembered, but wearing the same faded denim jacket she'd worn for years. Helen had lived next door since before I was born. She and Grandma drank coffee together almost every morning during the summer. She wrapped me in a hug before stepping back. I wondered when you'd finally come. What do you mean? She studied my face carefully. So, nobody told you? Told me what? Helen sighed. I promised your grandmother I wouldn't interfere unless you came asking. Asking about what? She glanced toward the cabin before lowering her voice. The last 2 years your father kept telling everyone you were finished with this place. That's not true. I know. She nodded slowly. Margaret knew too. I felt my heartbeat quicken. Did Grandma ever say anything about selling the cabin? Helen looked genuinely surprised. Selling it? I explained what had happened at the attorney's office. The $1 sale, the interrupted closing, Melissa's announcement. By the time I finished, Helen looked more disturbed than I did. No, she said firmly. Your grandmother never talked about selling. What did she say? Helen stared across the lake for several seconds. Then she smiled sadly. The last summer before she got sick, we were sitting right over there. She pointed toward the weathered bench facing the shoreline. I asked her whether Logan would eventually inherit the cabin. And Helen looked directly into my eyes. Margaret said, people keep asking who will own this place. She paused. Then she smiled and told me. Helen repeated every word exactly as Grandma had spoken them. They're asking the wrong question. Catalina knows what this cabin is really for. I felt a chill despite the warm afternoon. If Grandma had expected me to understand something, what exactly had she left for me to find? As Helen walked back toward her house, I unlocked the front door for the first time in nearly a year. Inside, everything smelled of cedar and old books. Nothing appeared disturbed. Until I noticed one empty space on Grandma's writing desk. A small metal document box had always sat in the corner. It was gone. The missing document box bothered me far more than it should have. Most people would have noticed the furniture first, or the faded curtains, or the fact that someone had swept the floors recently. I noticed a square of lighter wood on Grandma Margaret's desk where a heavy metal box had rested for at least 20 years. The varnish beneath it had never been exposed to sunlight. Now it was. Someone hadn't just cleaned the desk. Someone had removed exactly one item. I stood there for almost a full minute before touching anything else. Old habits from work. When I reviewed commercial real estate compliance files, assumptions caused mistakes. Observations solved them. I pulled out my phone and photographed the entire room. The desk, the empty space, the bookshelves, the filing cabinet, even the windows. Not because I expected those pictures to become evidence, because if something changed later, I wanted a record of how I first found it. Grandma would have approved. I searched every drawer carefully. Nothing looked forced open, no broken locks, no scattered papers. Whoever had removed the metal box either had permission to enter or already possessed a key. That narrowed the list considerably. Only 3 people still had keys after Grandma passed away. Harold, Logan, me. I closed the final drawer and sat quietly in Grandma's chair. The silence inside the cabin felt different now. Not peaceful. Interrupted. Someone had come looking for something. The question was whether they'd found it. By the following morning, I was standing inside the Pine County Recorder's office. It wasn't a large government building. A single public counter, 3 employees. Shelves filled with decades of recorded documents that had gradually been digitized but were still backed by paper originals. A gray-haired man looked up from his computer. "Can I help you? I'm Catalina Freeman." He smiled politely. "What can we pull for you today?" "I'm looking for the complete recording history on one parcel." He handed me a request form. "Property address." I filled it out carefully. He glanced at the address before looking back at me. The Freeman Lake cabin. You know it. He nodded. Old properties usually have interesting histories. I'm hoping this one does. My name's Daniel Whitmore. He reached for the paperwork. Give me about 15 minutes. While he disappeared into the archive area, I called Melissa Carter. I hoped you'd call, she said, before I even introduced myself. You did. I stayed late yesterday. Why? I wanted to review every filing connected to your grandmother's property. And I think we should look at the documents together. At your office, if possible. I'll be there this afternoon. Her voice became more serious. Catalina. Yes. Your father wasn't entirely wrong yesterday. That caught me off guard. What do you mean? He does own an interest in the property. But ownership isn't always as simple as people think. Daniel returned carrying 2 thick archive folders. They don't make files like this anymore. He placed them gently on the counter. Most modern transactions fit inside 20 pages. He smiled. Your grandmother liked paperwork. I couldn't help smiling back. That's one way to describe her. He opened the earliest file. This is the original deed from the late 1980s. I leaned closer. Grandma Margaret and Grandpa Thomas had purchased the property together. Nothing surprising. The next filing documented Grandpa's death years later. Again expected. Then Daniel stopped at a document recorded 9 years before Grandma died. This one stands out. Why? He slid it toward me. I don't see many families using this type of transfer anymore. The heading immediately caught my attention. Enhanced Life Estate Deed. I had seen similar instruments during commercial transactions, though they were uncommon. Daniel explained it in simple terms. This allowed your grandmother to keep complete control of the property during her lifetime. I nodded. So she remained owner. Exactly. But she also planned what would happen later. I kept reading. Grandma had transferred a future ownership interest while retaining full authority over every decision until her death. The future interest listed Harold Freeman. That explained why my father believed the cabin belonged entirely to him. But Melissa had stopped the closing. Something else had to exist. Daniel turned another page. There. Attached to the recorded deed was a separate document, recorded covenant regarding future transfer. I frowned. I've never seen this attached before. Neither have I. He adjusted his glasses. It's unusual. I began reading slowly. The language wasn't difficult. It simply required patience. The covenant explained that any future sale or transfer outside the property's intended family purpose required written approval from another named party. I reached the final paragraph. My name, Catalina Freeman. I looked back at Daniel. So, he nodded. That's why the attorney stopped yesterday. I don't own the cabin. No. But according to what's recorded, no qualifying transfer can occur without your written consent. I stared at the page again. Grandma had recorded this publicly, not hidden inside a will, not buried in private estate papers, publicly. Anyone performing a proper title search should have found it, including yesterday's closing. I suddenly understood why Melissa looked so calm while my father became increasingly frustrated. The documents weren't ambiguous. They were sitting in county records. Waiting. Melissa spread the documents across her conference table later that afternoon. I wanted to explain something. She pointed toward the deed. Your father inherited exactly what your grandmother chose to give him. So he wasn't lying. No. He simply misunderstood what he received. She flipped to the covenant. Or ignored it. What's the difference legally? If he genuinely misunderstood the court, treats that differently than knowingly bypassing a recorded restriction. She paused. Intent matters. I appreciated that answer. Too many people assumed legal disputes were about catching villains. Most weren't. They were about determining what actually happened. Melissa continued. Your grandmother separated ownership from authority. Meaning, your father could maintain the property. She pointed to one section. He could insure it. Another section. He could pay taxes. Another. He could even make improvements. But selling it, different. She tapped the covenant. That's where your approval became necessary. I leaned back in my chair. Why would Grandma do that? Melissa smiled slightly. I wondered the same thing. She reached into another folder. I requested certified copies instead of relying only on the digital scan. She handed me the original recording packet. Everything matched, except one detail. Near the bottom of the covenant appeared a sentence. Attached memorandum incorporated by reference. I looked through every page. Nothing followed. Where's the memorandum? Melissa had already anticipated this question. It isn't here. Missing. Apparently, it was recorded. Referenced. She chose her words carefully, not necessarily attached. So where is it? I don't know. We both sat quietly. Finally, I asked the question neither of us wanted to answer. If that memorandum explained Grandma's intentions, Melissa finished the sentence, then someone may have removed the only surviving copy. That evening, I drove to my father's house, not to accuse him, to ask one simple question. Harold answered the door looking irritated. I figured you'd calm down eventually. I'm not here to argue. He folded his arms. What do you want? I visited the recorder's office. His expression barely changed. I expected you would. I found Grandma's covenant. So, it names me. I know. You knew. He shrugged. Your grandmother worried too much. I studied him carefully. You already knew I had to approve any sale. It's outdated paperwork. No, it's recorded. He sighed heavily. Catalina. Yes. Those old documents don't matter anymore. I held his gaze. Melissa Carter disagrees. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked past me toward my car. Then he quietly asked a question that sent another warning through my mind. Did you happen to find your grandmother's memorandum? Every instinct I had sharpened at once. I hadn't mentioned the missing memorandum, not once. I didn't answer my father immediately. Instead, I asked a question of my own. What memorandum? For the first time since this whole ordeal began, Harold Freeman hesitated. It lasted less than 2 seconds, but it was there. People who tell the truth usually answer questions. People protecting information often answer the question they wish had been asked instead. I don't know what Melissa's been filling your head with, he said, leaning against the door frame. I'm just saying your grandmother kept a lot of paperwork. So you don't know about a memorandum? I said she kept paperwork. That's not what I asked. His jaw tightened. Catalina, you're turning this into something it isn't. I held his gaze. I hope you're right. I left before the conversation became another circular argument. There was no point confronting him with suspicions I couldn't prove. Yet one fact refused to leave my mind. He had known about the missing memorandum before I ever mentioned it. The next morning, Melissa called before I had finished my coffee. I have something. What is it? I pulled the preliminary title commitment from the closing file. And, you should come in. Half an hour later, I was sitting across from her conference table again. She slid a thick folder toward me. Read page 11. It wasn't the purchase agreement. It wasn't even the deed. It was the title company's list of exceptions and requirements before closing. Near the bottom, one sentence had been highlighted. Written consent from Catalina Freeman required pursuant to recorded covenant dated May 18, 2017. I looked up. They knew. Melissa nodded. Everyone involved in the transaction knew. The title company. Yes. The buyers. Yes. My father. Yes. My brother. Almost certainly. I took a slow breath. So no one accidentally forgot to tell me. Melissa folded her hands. From everything I've reviewed, no. The realization hurt more than I expected. For almost 2 weeks I had tried convincing myself this might have been a misunderstanding. Maybe paperwork had been rushed. Maybe someone assumed I'd agree. Maybe Dad believed the covenant no longer mattered. The title commitment destroyed those possibilities. Everyone preparing the transaction knew my signature was legally required. No one contacted me. Instead, they scheduled the closing anyway, as though they hoped I simply wouldn't appear. Melissa opened another folder. I also received authorization to review some supporting financial documents. From who? Logan's lender. That surprised me. Why would they cooperate? They're concerned. She turned the folder around. They financed his expansion last year. I skimmed that first page. Business loan, commercial equipment financing, seasonal operating credit. The numbers weren't small. What happened? Melissa spoke carefully. I'm not an accountant, but this pattern isn't unusual. She pointed to a cash flow report. Logan expanded too quickly. His company, Northridge Outdoor Adventures, had added luxury lakeside cabins, guided fishing packages, and winter snowmobile tours. For 2 years, business looked strong. Then unusually warm winters reduced snowmobile traffic, fuel costs increased, insurance premiums climbed. Several large corporate retreats canceled after a recession affected travel budgets. Revenue fell. Debt remained. He isn't broke, Melissa explained. Not yet. But he doesn't have enough liquidity. I smiled. You've been talking to accountants. She laughed. A little. In plain English. He owns valuable equipment. But not enough cash? Exactly. And the bank wants repayment. Exactly. I continued reading. Several loans would mature within 4 months. Without additional collateral or a major capital injection, refinancing looked difficult. Suddenly, Harold's urgency made sense. He wasn't simply helping Logan. He was trying to save Logan's business. Family loyalty, panic, pride, not pure greed. Understanding that didn't excuse what they had done, but it explained it. And understanding motives often mattered more than judging them. An hour later, my phone buzzed. Logan. I considered ignoring it. Instead, I answered. You finally decided to talk. I've been busy. So have I. There was a long silence before he sighed. I don't want this turning ugly. It already has. You know Dad means well. I know he believes he does. Another pause. Catalina! His voice sounded tired, not manipulative, just exhausted. We're drowning. I've seen the loan documents. So you know. I know enough. I wasn't trying to steal anything. Then why didn't you tell me? I wanted to. What stopped you? He didn't answer immediately. Finally, he admitted Dad. That wasn't the response I expected. He said if we told you too early, you'd start asking legal questions. I closed my eyes. And that was a problem. You always ask legal questions. Because they matter. I know. He sounded defeated. He said if the closing got far enough along, you'd probably sign rather than embarrass the family. The honesty surprised me. So the plan was to pressure me. I hated it. But you went along. I thought you'd understand once everything was finished. I looked out Melissa's office window. Finished. Yeah. So after the cabin belonged to you. I would have explained. I couldn't help laughing. Not because anything was funny, because the logic was astonishing. You wanted forgiveness after removing my ability to make a decision. It wasn't like that. It was exactly like that. Neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked, why $1? He exhaled slowly. Because it wasn't really a sale. What was it? Dad thought transferring it cheaply would keep the bank from forcing an immediate liquidation. So the $1 was symbolic. Basically, but you planned to sell it afterward. Silence. Then, who told you that? I didn't say you planned to sell it. You just did. Another mistake, small, but revealing. Logan, I can't discuss that. Because it's true. Catalina? I asked one question. He hung up. Melissa looked at me after I lowered the phone. He confirmed it. Without realizing. She nodded thoughtfully. That's often how these conversations go. I stared at the lake visible beyond her office parking lot. I still don't understand something. What? If the goal was saving his business? Yes. Why wouldn't he simply keep the cabin? Melissa reached for another document. I wondered that too. She handed me a printed email that had arrived only minutes earlier. The sender was a commercial real estate broker. The subject line read, Updated Letter of Intent. Whispering Pines Development Group. I received this because the developer's attorney contacted everyone involved in the interrupted closing. I scanned the email. The developer expressed concern that ownership had not transferred as scheduled. Attached was a revised non-binding purchase proposal. Purchase price, environmental review period, survey contingency, estimated closing. I skipped straight to the financial terms. My breath caught. The proposed purchase price wasn't $1 million. Or $2. It exceeded $8 million. For a moment, I simply stared at the number. Not because Grandma's cabin itself was worth that much. The land wasn't. But nearly 200 acres of undeveloped lakeshore surrounding it certainly were. Everything suddenly aligned. The rushed transfer, the $1 sale, the secrecy, the pressure, the missing memorandum, the development stakes. None of this had ever been about preserving a family cabin. The cabin was merely sitting on land that had become extraordinarily valuable. Melissa quietly broke the silence. The buyer plans to build a luxury resort. I kept reading. Private marina, boutique hotel, vacation homes, expanded shoreline access, conference center. Then one sentence near the bottom stopped me cold. Existing cabin scheduled for demolition during Phase 1 construction. Grandma's cabin. Gone. I heard Helen Dawson's voice echo inside my head. Catalina knows what this cabin is really for. Maybe Grandma hadn't been protecting the building at all. Maybe she had been protecting everything around it. Just then, Melissa's assistant knocked gently on the conference room door. Melissa? What is it? The developer's attorney is online too. Melissa looked at me. He says there's another document we've never seen. Melissa excused herself to take the call. I stayed in the conference room staring at the developer's proposal that was still spread across the table, $8 million. If someone had asked me a week earlier how much Grandma's cabin was worth, I probably would have answered somewhere between $600,000 and $800,000, depending on the condition of the buildings and the surrounding land. I would have been wrong. Not because the cabin itself had suddenly become more valuable, because everything around it had. The region had become one of the fastest-growing recreational destinations in northern Minnesota. Investors weren't buying old cabins anymore. They were buying waterfront acreage. The cabin simply happened to be sitting in the middle of nearly 200 acres of it. The more I thought about it, the more another question emerged. If developers had been approaching the property for years, how long had my father known? Melissa returned a few minutes later carrying a legal pad filled with handwritten notes. That was interesting. I'll take interesting over mysterious. She smiled faintly. I spoke with the developer's attorney, and they're just as confused as we are. Confused. They believed your brother already controlled the property, so they've been negotiating with him. For several months. I leaned forward. They've spent months negotiating something he didn't actually have the authority to sell, Melissa nodded. They assumed he would. What changed? The interrupted closing. She tapped the folder. The moment I stopped yesterday's transaction, their legal department ordered another title review. And they found me. They found the covenant. She hesitated before continuing. Their attorney apologized. For what? For relying on your family's representations instead of independently verifying every recorded restriction earlier in negotiations. That answer surprised me. So they weren't trying to work around me. No. They're frustrated. Melissa looked almost sympathetic toward the developer. They've already spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on preliminary engineering studies. I let out a slow breath. Everyone had assumed the transfer would happen. Everyone except Grandma. Melissa slid another document across the table. This wasn't part of the purchase proposal. The header immediately caught my attention. Environmental Assessment Summary. I looked up. What's this? The land isn't valuable only because of the lake. She pointed toward an aerial map. Several portions of the property were highlighted in green and blue. The shoreline contains restored wetlands. I frowned. Restored? Melissa nodded. The report says someone funded restoration work nearly 20 years ago. My mind immediately went to Grandma. The photographs, the annual shoreline inspections, the endless notes, the strange habit of documenting water levels every spring. She hadn't simply been obsessive. She'd been monitoring an environmental restoration project. Melissa continued explaining. In plain English, wetlands naturally filter water before it reaches the lake. So disturbing them, requires additional government review. I looked more closely at the report. Protected native plants, migratory bird habitat, restored shoreline vegetation, water quality monitoring. Everything suddenly connected. Grandma never cared whether I photographed the cabin. She cared whether I photographed the shoreline. She'd been tracking the health of the land, not the buildings. I remembered asking her when I was 13, "Why are we taking pictures of grass?" She'd smiled. "Because one day someone will wish it wasn't here." At the time I thought she was joking. Now I wasn't so sure. "There's one more thing," Melissa said. She reached into her briefcase. "I think we should visit someone." "Who?" "Frank Donnelly, the accountant. You know him. He handled your grandparents' taxes for nearly 30 years. I remember him. He retired recently." Melissa stood. "When I called this morning, he mentioned your grandmother left several archive boxes with him." I blinked. "Boxes?" He thought the estate had already collected them. They didn't. Apparently not. An hour later, we were driving toward a small town about 20 miles south of Pine Harbor. Frank Donnelly lived in a modest brick home with a detached workshop behind it. He answered the door before we knocked. "Catalina." His face softened immediately. "You've grown into your grandmother's eyes." I smiled. "I've missed seeing you." "I wish the circumstances were happier." He invited us inside. His office looked exactly like I remembered. Metal filing cabinets, shelves packed with tax binders, neatly labeled storage boxes. Nothing out of place. Frank didn't waste time. Margaret told me one day someone might come asking questions. I exchanged a glance with Melissa. "You expected this." I hoped I was wrong. He disappeared into a back room and returned pushing a small handcart. Stacked on top were 4 gray archive boxes. Each carried the same handwritten label. Freeman Cabin, Permanent Records. I felt my heartbeat quicken. She left all of these with you, Frank nodded. She said they were safer here than in the cabin. When? About 4 years before she passed. Melissa carefully opened the first box. Inside were folders organized by year. Insurance, taxes, maintenance, boundary surveys, permits. Everything meticulously indexed. Grandma had documented practically every significant event involving the property. Frank smiled when he saw my expression. She was convinced paper would outlive computers. I think she was right. We spent nearly 2 hours reviewing the files. Most confirmed things we already knew: repair invoices, timber inspections, water testing, volunteer conservation projects. Then Melissa stopped turning pages. What is it? She slowly lifted a cream-colored folder. Across the front in Grandma's unmistakable handwriting were 5 words. To be opened only if nothing else. The remainder of the sentence had been folded inside. Melissa looked at Frank. May we? He nodded. Margaret instructed me to release it only if someone attempted to transfer the property without Catalina's full participation. Silence filled the room. Melissa unfolded the cover. The complete title appeared. To be opened only if someone attempts to sell the cabin without Catalina Freeman's knowledge. My throat tightened. Grandma hadn't simply imagined conflict. She had predicted the exact situation. Inside rested several documents. A notarized memorandum, copies of correspondence, engineering reports, and a handwritten letter. Melissa picked up the memorandum first. This is the attachment. The missing one? She nodded. The document referenced by the recorded covenant. I stared at it. After days of searching, here it was. Exactly where Grandma intended it to be found. Melissa began reading aloud. The memorandum explained in clear language why the covenant existed. Grandma wrote that the cabin had never been intended as a financial asset. Its true purpose was preserving the shoreline restoration project that she and Grandpa had privately funded for nearly 2 decades. She specifically expressed concern that future economic pressures might tempt family members to sell the land without fully understanding its environmental significance. Every sentence sounded unmistakably like her. Practical, calm, never dramatic. Then came one paragraph that made the room completely silent. If my son Harold ever believes immediate financial need outweighs long-term stewardship, I ask that Catalina review every proposed transfer herself. She has the patience to ask questions before making irreversible decisions. Frank slowly removed his glasses. I remember when she wrote that. You do? He nodded. She wasn't angry. Then why? She loved Harold. He smiled sadly. But she understood him. Melissa kept reading. The memorandum concluded by incorporating several supporting documents into the property records. One of them immediately caught my attention. Minnesota Shoreline Conservation Partnership Agreement. I looked at Melissa. That's legally significant, isn't it? It could be. Before she could say anything else, Frank reached into the folder one last time. There was one document Margaret specifically told me never to hand over unless Catalina was present. He carefully unfolded a sealed legal-size envelope. Across the front, written in blue ink, were only 6 words. For the buyer who pays cash. Melissa and I looked at each other. Neither of us had any idea why Grandma would prepare a letter addressed to a buyer she had never met. Melissa carefully turned the sealed envelope over in her hands. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, but the seal was still intact. Frank Donnelly spoke before either of us did. Margaret gave me very specific instructions. What were they? I asked. That envelope was never to be opened simply because the family was arguing. Melissa looked up. So why now? Frank folded his hands across the desk. Because she said only one event would matter. He nodded toward the memorandum lying open on the table. If someone tried to sell the property. Silence settled over the room. Melissa finally broke it. The sale has already been attempted. Frank nodded once. Then her condition has been met. He slid the envelope toward Melissa. As the attorney handling the matter, I believe you're the appropriate person to open it. Melissa looked at me. Are you comfortable with that? I nodded. Grandma trusted legal process. So do I. She carefully broke the seal. Inside wasn't a personal letter. It was a formal document, typed, signed, notarized. Attached behind it were several exhibits. Melissa scanned the first page. Then she stopped reading. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. What is it? I asked. She looked directly at me. Your grandmother wasn't writing to a buyer. No, she was writing to any buyer. She handed me the first page. The opening paragraph read, If you are reading this, someone in my family has likely represented that they possess unrestricted authority to sell the Freeman cabin property. Before you invest another $1, I respectfully ask you to review the attached documents. They explain why preserving this land matters more than maximizing its sale price. I continued reading. Grandma explained the restoration history, the conservation work, the wetlands, the wildlife corridors. She even included contact information for state environmental officials who had worked with her over the years. Then one sentence stood out. Any purchaser unwilling to preserve these commitments should not own this land. I looked up. She expected developers? Melissa nodded, and she wanted them fully informed before buying. Frank smiled quietly. Margaret always believed honest business could survive full disclosure. The attached exhibits were even more revealing. The first contained aerial photographs spanning nearly 20 years. Every image showed the shoreline improving, native vegetation returning, wetlands expanding. The second contained grant agreements. I frowned. Grant agreements? Melissa leaned closer. These weren't private projects. Grandma had partnered with state conservation agencies and local environmental organizations. Some funding came from her own savings. Some came from matching grants. Everything had been documented. The final exhibit included correspondence with biologists who had monitored bird populations across the property. Grandma hadn't simply preserved family land. She had quietly restored an ecosystem. I suddenly remembered countless childhood mornings. While Logan slept late after fishing with friends, Grandma and I often walked the shoreline carrying clipboards. I'd count birds, measure water clarity, photograph nesting areas. I thought we were simply enjoying nature. In reality, we were collecting field observations. She had never burdened me with the importance of it. She simply let me participate. Melissa carefully stacked the documents. Catalina. Yes. I think we've been looking at this dispute too narrowly. What do you mean? We've been focused on ownership. She tapped the environmental files. But ownership isn't the whole story anymore. I understood immediately. If conservation agreements remained active, any future development could involve additional legal obligations completely separate from family inheritance. Harold might never have investigated those obligations. Neither had Logan. They simply saw valuable land. Grandma saw responsibilities attached to it. That afternoon, we returned to Melissa's office. She contacted the developer's attorney. His name was Andrew Collins. The call was placed on speaker. Mr. Collins. Melissa began. We've located documents your client should review before making further decisions. What kind of documents? Environmental agreements, archived memoranda, and correspondence prepared by Margaret Freeman. There was a pause. We weren't aware any such materials existed. I believe that. Melissa remained professional. But they do. Andrew spoke carefully. If these materials materially affect development, they very well might. We'll need copies. You'll receive certified copies. Another silence. Then Andrew surprised me. Ms. Freeman? I realized he was speaking to me. Yes, I owe you an apology. For what? My client relied heavily on representations made by your father and brother. I know. We assumed they had unrestricted authority. You weren't the only ones. He sighed. After reviewing the title issues yesterday, we've suspended negotiations. Melissa looked at me. I said nothing. Andrew continued. Frankly, my client has no interest in purchasing property that's legally disputed. That made sense. Large developers hated uncertainty. They could solve engineering problems, financing problems, construction delays. Family lawsuits were something else entirely. We appreciate your honesty, Melissa said. So do we, Andrew replied. But I should warn you, what? Our client isn't the only company that approached your family. The room became very quiet. Melissa frowned. What do you mean? We've learned at least 2 other developers expressed interest over the last 18 months. I felt my stomach tighten. So, Dad has been shopping the property around. It appears so. After ending the call, neither Melissa nor I spoke immediately. Finally, I asked, How many times? She answered honestly. I don't know, but probably more than once. 2 evenings later, Harold called me. I think we should talk. His tone was different, less confident, more tired. I've been trying. I mean privately. Why, so we can stop involving lawyers. I almost laughed. The lawyers became involved because no one involved me. He didn't argue. Instead, he asked, Can we meet at the cabin tomorrow? Will Logan be there? No, just us. Just us. Against my better judgment, I agreed. The following afternoon, Harold was already sitting on the old wooden bench overlooking the lake when I arrived. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, he said, Your grandmother loved this view. She did. I've been sitting here remembering. So have I. He looked older than he had only a week earlier, not physically, emotionally. Catalina, I know what you're going to say. You do. You'll tell me you were trying to save Logan. That's true? You'll tell me you weren't trying to hurt me. I wasn't. You'll tell me family should matter more than paperwork. He looked down at the ground. I probably would have said all of those things. I sat beside him. But, he reached into his jacket pocket. I found something. He handed me a folded piece of paper. It wasn't old. It wasn't legal. It was a printed email. The sender immediately caught my attention. Logan Freeman, the recipient, Whispering Pines Development Group. The subject line read, Revised Demolition Timeline. My heart began beating faster. Harold spoke quietly. I didn't know about this. I unfolded the remaining pages. Attached to the email was a preliminary construction schedule. Phase 1, site clearing, tree removal, cabin demolition, wetland grading, road expansion. Harold slowly rubbed his forehead. I thought Logan was selling the land. I looked at him. He was. Harold's voice cracked for the first time. I didn't realize he was planning to erase everything. Before I could answer, another vehicle turned into the gravel driveway. A black SUV. Melissa stepped out. She wasn't alone. Walking beside her was a woman wearing a state-issued identification badge clipped to her jacket. Melissa looked directly at me. "Catalina?" "What's wrong?" She took a slow breath. "This is Rachel Monroe from the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources." Rachel extended her hand. "I believe portions of your grandmother's property may now be protected under agreements no one in your family has fully disclosed." Rachel Monroe shook my hand firmly before looking toward the shoreline instead of the cabin. "I've wanted to visit this property for years," she said. Harold looked genuinely confused. "You've been here before?" Rachel nodded. "Many times." He stared at her. "I've never seen you." "That's because I usually met with your mother." Silence. Harold slowly lowered himself back onto the bench. "My mother never mentioned the Department of Natural Resources." Rachel didn't sound surprised. "Margaret preferred discussing conservation after the work was finished instead of while it was happening." Melissa carried a thick, expandable folder from her car. "I thought it would be easier if we looked at everything together." We moved on to the cabin's screened porch, where Grandma used to serve coffee every Sunday morning. The same wooden table was still there. Only this time it wasn't covered with blueberry muffins or crossword puzzles. It was covered with legal documents. Rachel opened the first map. It showed the entire property from above. Colored lines divided the land into several sections: blue, green, yellow. She pointed to the blue area first. These wetlands were restored between 2004 and 2011. Then the green. This woodland corridor connects two state-managed wildlife habitats. Finally, the yellow. This section contains the original cabin and surrounding recreational area. Harold frowned. "I knew about the wetlands." Rachel looked at him. "Did you?" "I knew Mom cared about them." Caring about them and understanding the legal commitments aren't the same thing. She pulled another document from the folder. "This is the Stewardship Cooperation Agreement your mother signed." I leaned closer. Unlike the property covenant Melissa had already shown me, this agreement wasn't about ownership. It was about obligations. Rachel explained it in plain language. "Your grandmother voluntarily entered a long-term conservation partnership." "Does that mean the state owns the land?" Harold asked. "No." "So what does it mean?" "It means ownership remains private." She paused. "But certain promises travel with the property." I immediately understood. "Like recorded easements." "Very similar." Rachel smiled. "Exactly." Harold looked frustrated. "So nobody can ever do anything with it." "I didn't say that." She calmly pointed toward another section. "The cabin can be repaired. The docks can be maintained. Trails can be improved. But large-scale development affecting protected areas requires extensive review." She wasn't exaggerating. The maps clearly showed why. Any resort large enough to justify an $8 million purchase would inevitably disturb portions of the restored shoreline. The very shoreline Grandma had photographed every spring. Melissa organized the documents into separate stacks. "Let's separate what's emotional from what's legal." I appreciated that sentence. Too many family disputes collapsed because people mixed the two together. She pointed to the first pile. "These establish Catalina's approval rights." The second. "These explain Margaret's intentions." The third. "These involve environmental commitments." Then she looked at Harold. "Each stands independently." He rubbed his forehead. "So even if Catalina signed," Melissa finished the thought, "the conservation obligations would still exist." "And even if those obligations didn't exist?" "Catalina's consent would still be required," Rachel added quietly. "And even if Catalina consented and environmental approvals were obtained, buyers would still need numerous additional permits." Harold sat silently. For the first time since I'd arrived in Minnesota, he wasn't arguing. He was processing. I made a terrible assumption. His voice was almost a whisper. Nobody answered. He continued anyway. I assumed because your mother trusted me to manage the cabin. He looked toward me. She trusted me to decide its future. Melissa spoke gently. Those aren't the same responsibility. No. He shook his head. They aren't. He reached into his jacket and removed a folded photograph. I found this yesterday. He handed it to me. It showed Grandma and me standing knee-deep in the marsh. I couldn't have been older than 12. We were both holding measuring poles. On the back, written in Grandma's neat handwriting, Catalina understands that care comes before ownership. My throat tightened. I'd never seen that picture before. Harold looked away. I found dozens of photographs. In Mom's bedroom. Every one of you. Not Logan. He was in some. He swallowed. But every picture connected to the shoreline. You were standing beside her. I didn't know what to say. Not because it proved Grandma loved me more. It didn't. Grandma loved all of us. It proved something else. She intentionally trained the person she believed would continue her work. Later that afternoon, Rachel asked if she could walk the property. I'd like to compare the current conditions with our historical records. I'll come with you, I said. We followed the shoreline exactly as Grandma and I had done countless times. Rachel occasionally stopped to examine native grasses or small wooden survey markers almost hidden beneath the vegetation. They're still here. What? The original monitoring points. I looked carefully. Tiny metal markers protruded only an inch above the ground. I'd walked past them dozens of times as a child. I had always assumed they marked property boundaries. They were never boundary markers, Rachel explained. They measured shoreline recovery. Everything suddenly made even more sense. Grandma hadn't invented those annual inspections. She'd participated in a structured conservation program. She simply turned them into summer activities for me. Not lessons, memories. I smiled despite everything happening around us. She was teaching me without making it feel like homework. Rachel laughed. That sounds exactly like Margaret. As we reached the northern edge of the property, Rachel suddenly stopped walking. She crouched beside a faded wooden stake. What is it? I asked. Instead of answering immediately, she brushed away leaves covering a small aluminum marker. Stamped into the metal were several numbers. And one phrase, Protected Monitoring Site 7. Rachel stood slowly. I don't remember this being here. You don't? No. She examined it again. This marker was installed recently. Recently, she nodded. The original monitoring markers looked completely different. A strange feeling settled over me. If this isn't yours, then someone else placed it. We followed the line of freshly cut brush extending deeper into the woods. Within a few minutes, we reached a clearing. The ground was covered with bright orange ribbon tied around trees. Each ribbon carried handwritten numbers. I recognized the system immediately. Not conservation markings, logging and clearing estimates. Rachel's expression hardened. This wasn't authorized. I photographed everything before touching nothing. Another lesson from compliance work. Observe first, preserve evidence, ask questions later. Rachel removed her phone. I'm documenting this for our file. I looked around the clearing. Several trees already had fluorescent paint marks. One enormous white pine had a large red X sprayed across its trunk. Grandma used to call it the guardian tree. She claimed it had survived more than a century of storms. Someone intended to cut it down. Before either of us spoke again, my phone vibrated. The caller ID read, Melissa Carter. I answered immediately, Melissa, Catalina, where are you? On the north side of the property. I need you back at the cabin. Why? Her voice remained calm, but I could hear urgency underneath it. Someone just delivered a certified package addressed to you. From who? It wasn't signed by a person. She paused. It was sent by First National Trust Services, the company that handled your grandmother's estate. By the time Rachel and I returned to the cabin, Melissa was standing on the porch with a large certified envelope resting on the table. She hadn't opened it. She hadn't even broken the seal. I wanted you to see it exactly as it arrived, she said. I looked at the return address. First National Trust Services below it was a reference number, not my grandmother's estate, a trust administration file. Harold stood up slowly. I've never seen that company before. Melissa glanced at him. That doesn't surprise me. Why not? Because this isn't part of probate. She looked back at me. It's connected to a trust administration file that remained inactive until certain conditions were met. I frowned. What conditions? We're about to find out. She slid the envelope toward me. I carefully opened it. Inside was a cover letter, several certified copies, and a flash drive. The letter began with a sentence that immediately caught everyone's attention. Dear Ms. Catalina Freeman, this file has been released because our office has received formal notice of an attempted transfer of the Freeman cabin property. I looked at Melissa. They were waiting. She nodded. They weren't waiting for Margaret's death. They were waiting for someone to try selling the property. I continued reading. The trust company explained that Grandma Margaret had instructed them not to contact anyone unless the property's recorded transfer restriction was ever challenged or ignored. If that happened, they were to release every archived document to the person identified in the covenant. Me. Harold quietly sat back down. I had no idea. I believed him. This wasn't surprise performed for sympathy. It looked genuine. The next document was titled Declaration of Stewardship Intent. Unlike the memorandum Frank had preserved, this wasn't written for family. It was written for future trustees, attorneys, lenders, and courts. Grandma anticipated that one day, strangers not relatives might need to understand why the property had been structured so carefully. Melissa read portions aloud. Margaret intentionally separated emotional inheritance from legal authority. She looked at me. That's an important sentence. I nodded. Grandma had never wanted one person controlling everything. Harold received management responsibilities. I received oversight responsibilities. Neither role was superior. They were designed to balance each other. The more I read, the more obvious her thinking became. She wasn't protecting the property from one specific person. She was protecting every future generation from making irreversible decisions during moments of financial desperation. The flash drive contained scanned correspondence, engineering reports, conservation audits, photographs. Then one folder caught my attention. Board minutes. What board? I asked. Melissa opened the files. For nearly 15 years, Grandma had quietly assembled a volunteer advisory committee. Not a formal corporation, not a government agency, just professionals she trusted. An environmental scientist, an accountant, a retired judge, a forester. Their role had been simple. Review major decisions affecting the property if one was ever proposed. Harold looked stunned. Mom created a board. Rachel smiled. Margaret liked independent opinions. The meeting notes were remarkably practical. No emotional speeches, no family complaints, just questions. Would a timber harvest damage the shoreline? Would expanding the dock increase erosion? Would selling acreage reduce habitat connectivity? Each issue had been evaluated using facts instead of assumptions. I suddenly understood why Grandma rarely argued. She documented. She consulted experts. Then she made decisions. Near the bottom of the final meeting record appeared one paragraph highlighted in yellow. Melissa read it silently before handing it to me. I read it twice, then a third time. It said, "If circumstances ever require replacing the acting family trustee, I recommend appointing a professional fiduciary rather than another family member. Family relationships should never depend upon controlling shared property." Harold stared at the page. "So," he swallowed hard, "she never intended Logan to replace me." "No," Melissa answered gently. "And she never intended Catalina to replace you automatically either." "What did she intend? A neutral trustee." That answer changed the atmosphere completely. Until then, everyone, including me, had unconsciously viewed the dispute as a contest between siblings. Grandma never designed it that way. She expected accountability, not victory. 3 days later, the mediation ordered by the court finally began. The mediator introduced herself, explained the rules, and reminded everyone that her role wasn't to choose winners. It was to determine whether an agreement could be reached before additional litigation became necessary. Logan arrived looking exhausted, much thinner than he had only weeks earlier. Dark circles framed his eyes. When we took our seats, he surprised everyone. "I'd like to say something first." The mediator nodded. "You may." Logan looked directly at me. "I'm sorry." The room remained silent. "I should have told you about the negotiations." I listened without interrupting. "I knew Dad wanted to keep everything quiet." "I convinced myself we'd explain after the transfer." He shook his head. "That was cowardly." Harold looked down at the table. For the first time since this began, neither of them tried blaming me. Neither claimed I misunderstood. Neither mentioned family loyalty. They simply admitted the decision had been wrong. The apology mattered, but it didn't solve the legal problems. The mediator turned toward Melissa. "What remains unresolved?" Melissa answered clearly. "The attempted transfer has already failed. The immediate question is future governance." She summarized Grandma's recorded documents one by one. Catalina's approval rights, the conservation commitments, the trust company's declaration, the recommendation for an independent fiduciary, no dramatic language, just facts. The mediator took careful notes. Finally, she asked me, "Ms. Freeman, what outcome are you seeking?" Everyone looked at me. I realized I had spent so much time reacting that I hadn't clearly answered that question for myself. Did I want the cabin? No. Did I want Logan punished? Not really. Did I want my father humiliated? Definitely not. I took a slow breath. "I don't want revenge." The mediator nodded. "What do you want?" "I want my grandmother's plan respected." I looked toward Logan. "I don't object to you enjoying the cabin." Then toward Harold. "I don't object to Dad helping manage it." Finally toward everyone else. "But no one should ever be able to sell it secretly again." Melissa smiled slightly. The mediator leaned forward. "What are you proposing?" I opened the folder I'd prepared the night before. "I've drafted a framework." Harold looked surprised. "You already have." "I wanted to solve the problem instead of extending it." I distributed copies. The proposal created a permanent stewardship trust managed by an independent professional trustee. Major decisions would require written review. Annual financial reporting would be mandatory. Environmental obligations would remain intact. Family members could still use the cabin according to clear scheduling rules. No single person, including me, would possess unilateral authority to sell or mortgage the property. The mediator spent several minutes reading. Finally, she looked up. "This is remarkably balanced." Before anyone could respond, the conference room door opened. A court clerk stepped inside holding a sealed folder. "I'm sorry to interrupt." The mediator stood. "What is it?" We've just received today's court order. Melissa accepted the folder, opened it, and silently read the first page. Then she looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before. Not surprise, relief. The judge has approved temporary suspension of Harold's trustee authority. She turned another page. And appointed an independent fiduciary exactly as Margaret recommended years ago. No one spoke for several seconds after Melissa finished reading the court order. The mediator quietly reached across the table. May I see it? Melissa handed over the certified copy. The mediator read every page carefully before setting it down. This changes today's discussion. Harold nodded slowly. I suppose it does. There was no anger in his voice anymore. Only resignation. The court hadn't declared him a bad father. It hadn't accused him of fraud. It had simply concluded that the family no longer needed one relative making decisions alone. Grandma had anticipated exactly that possibility. The judge had followed the structure she created. The independent fiduciary arrived the following week. His name was Jonathan Pierce. He wasn't connected to our family. He wasn't connected to the developer. He wasn't connected to the state. He specialized in managing trusts involving family-owned real estate. The first thing Jonathan said surprised everyone. I'm not here to take anyone's property. He looked around the conference room. My job is to make sure the property's governing documents are followed. That distinction immediately lowered the tension. Harold asked the obvious question. So who owns the cabin now? Jonathan smiled politely. The ownership hasn't changed. He drew a simple diagram on a legal pad. Ownership. He circled one word. Management. Another circle. Oversight. A third. People often assume those are identical. They aren't. Melissa nodded approvingly. For nearly 15 minutes, Jonathan explained the arrangement in language everyone could understand. Harold retained the ownership interest Grandma had left him. Catalina, that was me, retained the approval authority established in the recorded covenant. The independent trustee supervised major decisions whenever those authorities overlapped. No one had won. The system itself had. Exactly as Grandma intended. The next challenge wasn't legal, it was practical. How would the cabin actually be used? Jonathan proposed something unexpected. Let's stop thinking about this property as an inheritance. What should we call it? Logan asked. A shared responsibility. He spread several blank sheets across the table. We're going to write operating policies. I almost laughed. It sounded exactly like one of my compliance meetings in Chicago. Only this time, the subject wasn't office buildings. It was the place where I'd learned to skip rocks. Over the next several hours, we discussed everything: scheduling, maintenance, insurance, emergency repairs, guest rules, financial reporting, volunteer conservation weekends, tree removal procedures, shoreline inspections. Nothing was considered too small to document. At one point, Logan sighed dramatically. Do we really need a written policy for replacing a dock? Jonathan answered without hesitation. If replacing a dock affects shoreline restoration... He looked toward Rachel Monroe, who had joined us virtually by video call. Then yes. Rachel smiled. I couldn't have said it better. Instead of arguing, Logan nodded. I guess that's fair. It was the first time I'd seen him accept structure instead of resisting it. Several weeks later, Jonathan invited all of us back to the cabin. Not for another legal meeting, for a property walk. I want everyone looking at the same land, he said, not the same paperwork. We followed the familiar trail toward the shoreline. Jonathan occasionally stopped to ask questions. What makes this section important? Rachel explained the wetland recovery. What about these trees? The consulting forester described erosion control. Why preserve this old cabin instead of replacing it? Before anyone answered, Harold quietly spoke. Because it's the reason the rest of this exists. Everyone turned toward him. He looked embarrassed. I finally understand. He rested one hand against the weathered cedar siding. I spent years thinking Mom loved this building. He shook his head. She loved what happened here. Family dinners, fishing trips, volunteer projects, grandchildren learning responsibility. The cabin wasn't the inheritance. It was the classroom. I felt tears threatening for the first time since all of this began. Not because Dad had apologized, because he had finally understood. There was a difference. Later that afternoon, Logan asked if we could talk alone. We walked down to the old dock where we'd spent countless summers as children. I owe you more than one apology. You don't owe me a performance. I'm not performing. He looked out across the lake. I really believed I could fix everything. I know. I thought if I sold the land, he stopped, I could save my business. What changed your mind? He laughed quietly. The demolition schedule. I looked at him. When Dad showed it to me, I finally imagined this place gone. He kicked gently at one of the wooden boards. I'd been looking at numbers for months. Loans. Interest. Cash flow. I stopped seeing the cabin. He turned toward me. I started seeing collateral. His honesty hurt, because I believed him. You know the worst part, he asked. What? I kept telling myself I was protecting the family. He smiled bitterly. But I never once asked what the family actually wanted. Neither of us spoke for a while. The lake was almost perfectly still. Finally, he said, if the trust allows it, I'd like to volunteer during restoration weekends. I smiled. I think Grandma would have liked that. I hope so. So do I. By early autumn, the stewardship trust officially became operational. Jonathan sent quarterly reports to every family member. Financial statements, maintenance summaries, environmental updates. Everything transparent. Exactly the opposite of how this story had begun. Even Harold admitted he appreciated knowing every decision before it happened. There are fewer arguments, he told me one afternoon, because nobody wonders what's happening. Transparency usually works that way. He smiled. I wish I'd learned that years ago. One Saturday morning, I was helping volunteers repair sections of the shoreline trail when Helen Dawson walked over carrying a small wooden box. I've been meaning to give you this. What is it? It was in Margaret's garage. Inside were dozens of old index cards. Each contained handwritten notes, dates, weather observations, wildlife sightings, volunteer names. And the very bottom lay one final card, written only a few months before Grandma passed away. It read, if Catalina is reading this someday, tell her she was never protecting my cabin. I smiled before turning over the card. The other side contained only one sentence. She was protecting everyone who would come after us. I carefully slipped the card back into the box. At that moment, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Jonathan. The court has signed the final order. The stewardship trust is now permanent. No future sale can occur outside its governing documents. I looked toward the lake. For the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about court, or lawyers, or developers. I was simply thinking about Grandma. A year later, I drove back to the cabin on the same road where this story had begun. Only this time, there wasn't a knot in my stomach. There wasn't an attorney waiting with a closing packet. There wasn't a family argument waiting to explode. The first thing I noticed wasn't the cabin. It was the shoreline. The native grasses had grown taller. The restored wetlands were thriving. The old guardian tree still stood at the edge of the trail, its branches stretching over the lake exactly as they had when I was a little girl. Rachel Monroe met me near the trailhead. You should see this, she said with a smile. She handed me the latest monitoring report. The water quality had improved again. Several bird species that hadn't nested in the area for years had returned. Volunteer hours had nearly doubled compared to the previous year. The stewardship trust hadn't simply protected the property, it had strengthened it. Grandma would have loved every page. The cabin itself looked almost unchanged. That had been intentional. Jonathan Pierce believed preservation didn't mean freezing a place in time. It meant repairing what mattered without erasing its history. The roof had been replaced. The porch had been reinforced. The old windows had been restored instead of discarded. Even the faded cedar siding remained. "It still feels like Margaret's cabin," Jonathan said as we walked inside. "I think that's the point." He smiled. "It is." A framed document now hung in the entryway. It wasn't a family portrait. It wasn't a deed. It was the mission statement of the Freeman Stewardship Trust. The opening sentence read, "This property exists to preserve land, strengthen family responsibility, and serve future generations." No names were listed beneath it. No one person's authority was celebrated. Grandma had never wanted that. Every spring, the cabin now hosted a conservation weekend. Local high school students worked alongside volunteers. Retired foresters taught tree identification. Biologists explained wetland restoration. Children helped install bird nesting boxes. I spent most of the morning showing teenagers how to document shoreline changes using photographs. One girl, maybe 13 years old, looked at me and asked, "Why do we take pictures of the same places every year?" I couldn't help smiling, because I'd asked Grandma that exact question decades earlier. "So we notice changes before they become problems." She nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense." I hoped one day she'd remember that lesson the way I remembered Grandma's. Sometimes the smallest habits become the strongest forms of protection. Around lunchtime, I saw Harold walking slowly toward me carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to me. "I still remember how your grandmother took hers. 2 sugars. And just a little cream." We both laughed. For a while, we simply watched the volunteers working along the shoreline. Finally, he spoke. "I've rehearsed this conversation 100 times. You don't have to. I do." He looked at the lake before continuing. "I spent most of my life believing being the oldest meant being responsible for making every important decision." I listened quietly. "When your mother and I were raising you kids, I thought protecting the family meant keeping control." He shook his head. "I confused control with responsibility." He looked directly at me. "When I sold that cabin to Logan for $1, I truly believed I was saving him." "I know. But I wasn't asking whether the decision was right. I was asking whether I could make it." He paused. "And those aren't the same question." I felt years of tension begin to loosen. Not disappear, just loosen. "I'm sorry, Catalina. I should have trusted you enough to tell you the truth before I tried solving everything behind your back." His apology didn't erase what had happened. It didn't undo the secrecy. It didn't return the weeks of anxiety or the damaged trust, but it was honest. That mattered. "I forgive you," I said. His shoulders relaxed. Then I added something just as important. "But forgiveness doesn't mean we go back to the way things were." He nodded immediately. "I know." I don't want us making decisions without transparency ever again. "You won't. I mean that." "So do I." That was the moment I realized something had changed. Dad wasn't apologizing because a judge had ruled against him. He was apologizing because he finally understood why Grandma had built safeguards instead of relying on promises. Logan joined us later that afternoon carrying a toolbox. Not business plans, not development proposals, a toolbox. He'd spent almost every volunteer weekend repairing fences, rebuilding footbridges, and maintaining trails. His outdoor business still existed, just on a smaller scale. He'd sold equipment, restructured loans, closed locations that weren't profitable. The process had been painful, but it had been honest. "I brought the replacement hinges," he said, "for the boathouse." "Yeah." "They finally rusted out." I laughed. "Grandma would have said they lasted longer than expected." He smiled. "I've started saying that too." As we walked toward the boathouse, he stopped beside the old dock. "You know?" "What?" "I kept thinking losing that development deal ruined my future. And it probably saved it. How? If I'd sold this place," he looked across the lake, "I would have spent the rest of my life explaining why Grandma's cabin disappeared." He let that thought sit between us. Now I get to explain why it's still here. I couldn't think of a better answer. Before sunset, everyone gathered near the shoreline for a small dedication ceremony. Nothing elaborate, just family volunteers, neighbors, and the people who had helped protect the property. Helen Dawson spoke briefly about Grandma. Rachel thanked the volunteers. Jonathan summarized the first year of the trust. Then he surprised me. "Catalina," he said, "would you like the final report?" He handed me a bound copy. The cover simply read, "Year 1 Stewardship Report." Inside were financial statements, maintenance records, volunteer statistics, environmental monitoring results. Everything transparent, everything documented. Exactly the way Grandma would have wanted. As I closed the report, I remembered something she'd told me when I was 10 years old. "I trust people who pay attention." For years, I thought she was talking about tools, or shoreline markers, or paperwork. She wasn't. She was talking about people. Pay attention to what they say. Pay attention to what they avoid saying. Pay attention to the documents they ask you to sign. Pay attention to the promises that are never written down. Most importantly, pay attention to your own instincts when something feels wrong. If I had ignored the attorney's phone call, if Melissa hadn't insisted on following the recorded documents, if I had signed out of guilt instead of asking questions, everything Grandma spent decades protecting would have disappeared within months. Not because my family was evil, but because fear had become louder than patience. In the end, justice didn't come from exposing villains. It came from respecting facts. Healing didn't begin when the court ruled in my favor. It began when every person involved accepted that love and accountability can exist at the same time. And sometimes the strongest way to honor the people who came before us isn't by holding tighter to what they left behind. It's by protecting the values they built into it. The hardest lesson I learned wasn't about property law or real estate. It was about boundaries. Many of us are raised to believe that saying no to family is an act of betrayal. But healthy boundaries are not punishment. They are a way of protecting relationships from becoming dependent on secrecy, guilt, or control. My father wasn't beyond redemption, and my brother wasn't beyond change. What they needed wasn't unlimited access. They needed accountability. Forgiveness also turned out to be very different from restoration. I chose to forgive because I didn't want bitterness to shape the rest of my life. But forgiveness did not mean handing back unrestricted authority or pretending the past never happened. Trust had to be rebuilt through honesty, transparency, and consistent actions over time. If you've ever been pressured to sacrifice your own judgment for the family, I hope this story reminds you that asking questions is not selfish. Reading the documents, seeking legal advice, and protecting what matters most are acts of responsibility, not disloyalty. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever faced a situation where setting boundaries with family was necessary? Share your experience in the comments. Your story might encourage someone else who is struggling with the same choice. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about family justice, resilience, and healing, consider subscribing so we can continue these conversations together. This is a fictional story created for entertainment, education, and reflection.